Hi, Tim here with Michael Sacca, EVP and General Manager at Dribble. Michael is also the president at Crew Labs, where he secured key partnerships with Squarespace and BDC before leading the company through its acquisition by Dribble in 2017. How's it going, Michael?
Good, good. Excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Hey, my pleasure. Can we kick things off with a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, right. So, like you said, I've been at Dribble for about 4 years now. I've actually held almost every leadership position in the company, from the marketing, sales, strategy, and data product. And then I moved into the general manager role in the last year as we acquired Creative Market and we set up two subsidiaries. And so we now have a parent company, and I run the Dribble business unit within that. So I've been doing that for about the last 4 years. Before that, I was at Crew, is actually the parent company of Unsplash. If people are familiar, we broke it out. We sold Crew to Dribble. That's how I ended up here. Before that, I built agencies, so design agencies. So I've worked in the tech space for a long time, always as an operator. I'm excited to be here, share some, whatever we're going to talk about today.
Well, I like how you got the diversity in your background from the different lenses and views, and both small and large scale.
Yeah.
But yeah, I want to hear, what are your top principles for success and leadership?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I think one of the most important things is just consistency, right? Is setting measurements and goals for your team, but then being consistent and following up in them. And I think it's really easy to set KPIs and let people slip. And the harder job is to set the KPIs and follow up with them and really help to coach your team to hit the numbers that you need to be hitting. And that's something that I work on actually with our leadership team, is to give them the tools that they need and really the confidence that they need to be able to work through issues with anyone that works on the Dribble team, to make sure that we're constantly growing. And like I said, it's really easy to set the KPIs, miss them, set new ones the next quarter. It's a lot harder to be diligent about following up and making sure that you're constantly making progress.
How do you start thinking about that in your own daily life?
So daily life is messy, right?
Yeah, but it's not consistent to begin with.
So, I mean, I think that one is daily life and work life. I treat differently, right? I think work life, we have to have processes. We have to set those up for our team. Me personally, I mean, personal life, things are always coming at you, right? So if we focus on organizational design and setup, right? So where do we start? Is laying out a framework for what success looks like. And you can do that in your personal life, right? You can determine, what does success look like for you. Once you know that, you're working backwards from it. So, as an organization, we know what our revenue goals are, or what our key metrics are that we want to hit. The system design comes from working backwards from that, assigning the key players and the people who are going to be responsible for those metrics at each stage, and then giving the team accountability so that they own and that personal ownership. Now, you do that with yourself too, right? If you want to wake up at 6 a.m., try to wake up at 6 a.m. every day, right? Some days you don't. Some days you get up at 7. Sometimes you get up at 8:30 and you forgive yourself and you move on. But you should start to see progress, right? And whatever you're doing, if you're not making progress, then you might have bitten off something a bit too big. So you want the goal to be achievable. You don't want it to be achievable 100% of the time, but you want it to be achievable at least 70, 80% of the time. And so if your goal is to wake up early in the morning and do 3 things before, get 3 things done before you start your day, make sure that you're doing that at least 80% of the time. So 4 out of 5 days a week. If you can't do that, then start smaller. And that's kind of how we set up the same organizational system internally, to make sure that the goals are achievable, so it feels good that you're making progress, but they're not too easy that you hit it every time, because then you're not actually growing.
Okay, let's use a simple example. I want to write a book. And to do that, I need to spend a good hour a day working at this book, at least. And to add that extra hour a day in my busy schedule, I need to get up early, get up at 6 in the morning.
Yep.
So now I'm building backwards, right? Working backwards, say, hey, I need this hour a day. I'm going to add this earlier time so I can squeeze in an hour before the day gets going, because I know that's my jam and best time for me to write is first thing in the morning. And then from there, what would my metrics look like? Is the fact that I'm spending that hour and seeing the progress and saying, hey, maybe it's the pages that, or my goal is to hit 200 pages in 6 months. Then it's like, okay, maybe this many every month I need to make sure I have like whatever, 20, 30 pages drafted.
Yep. So here's what if we were really taking about writing a book, right? And so I interviewed author Elliot Pepper, who's written, I believe, about 10 books now in the last 5 years, right? And he's fairly prolific, but he has a very standardized system. So he actually starts, his metrics are just write each day. And so he tries to break up his time so that he's got that set schedule, but life happens. It's messy, right? And so you don't get up at every morning at 6, but can you squeeze in 30 minutes by the end of the day? That's a win, right? So at least you're writing. Doesn't matter how much you write or how little, but you start to form that habit of writing every single day. And it's way better if you could do it at the same time every day, because that really becomes the habit. So if you can write from 6 to 7 every morning, that's great. But things are going to happen. Your kids are going to get sick. You're going to have emergencies. You're going to have other commitments that come up. You're going to stay up too late. You're not going to be able to get up. Like, those things are going to happen. You have to forgive yourself, right? It's okay. So if you set your goal at just write every day, you're going to make progress. And some days you're going to write 10 pages. Some days you're going to write 1. And you can't fault yourself for that either. As long as you made the intention to sit down and write, that's what's really important on that personal level. And that's what Elliot does. Some days he's prolific and he just churns through chapter after chapter and he just keeps going, right? And maybe that day he writes for 3 hours because he's just on a roll. Other days he's just staring at a blank piece of paper. But he still makes himself sit there and stare at that piece of paper for that hour until he gets something on the page.
I like that, because you're creating these milestones, but then you're giving yourself a little buffer that if something comes up, you can still achieve it. So it's a good way to.
I mean, if you go from not writing ever to writing something every day, you're making progress. That's good. You should feel good about that.
I agree. That's like trying to get my kids to read. It's like, let's try reading a page today. And
exactly.
Work on 2 pages next time.
And eventually maybe they get to the point where they're so immersed in the story that they just take it up themselves, right? But it's probably going to take 6 months to a year to get them to the point where they're really going to love it. And I think any discipline that we start, we have to start small. And so when we look at a professional environment, ideally the people that you're hiring already have the skill, right? They already have the skill, they have the interest, they have the drive. But yeah, sometimes on the personal, when you're picking up something new and adding something new to your day, one, what are you going to give up? So if you're going to write a book, you still can't do everything else. So what are you not going to do in order to do that? And why is that book the most important thing? Is that the most impactful thing that will change the trajectory of where you're going, right? So you decide yes, right? And then you move forward with an action plan that walks before you run. I think we do the same thing with our organizations in creating successful organizations, is really setting up that same plan for every single person on our team to make sure that they're growing and striving and they're challenged.
And then them meeting milestones develops the consistencies. What about the follow-ups? Where does that come in? Because you told me that's actually more important than the consistency part.
Yeah. I mean, setting the goal is, right? You say, I want to write a book. That's anyone can, I want to write a book, right?
Right.
But who's the person that gets up every morning at 6 a.m. and actually writes the book?
Right.
That's the hard part. And so for our teams, we actually have an advantage, right? So maybe the similar thing is if you had an accountability coach, or you had a friend that was like, hey, you said you're going to do this. Are you making progress? Right. And it's kind of the same system we set up internally. Every week, I meet with all of our leadership team. We do weekly one-on-ones, and every week they're meeting with every person on their team. And so we do weekly one-on-ones, and those are the check-ins where we make sure that we're making progress. And that's our accountability checks. And we do the same thing with our product processes. We have accountability checks in place. And we check in on those every single week, if not more often. And so that allows us and really forces us to do is nobody wants to show up to that meeting and say, I didn't, right? You don't want to go to your coach or your friend and say, I didn't, it was a bad week. You could do that once, you do that twice, but after a while, they're going to lose interest.
Right.
In
You're like,
he's not that serious. Right. So forcing that accountability for yourself, it's hard to do if it's just you. It's much easier to do within a community, or at least within, you know, a marriage, a community, a partnership, or an organization, right? And having someone to keep you accountable is really key to forcing these habits. We try to create these habits individually, but we're not meant to be solo machines, right? We are community beings. And so I think it's incredibly important, if you have a personal mission, to set yourself up with some kind of system of accountability, so that you have to go to somebody and say, this is what I did. And that could be a 2-minute text. It could be a 30-minute call every week, but at least you have to go and say, I did this, or I didn't do this. And that pressure alone, it will force you to, it's that extra kind of hurdle to force you to actually make progress.
I can see that. So essentially the follow-up is creating that mechanism for accountability where you got to check it in to something.
Yeah.
Could be a team you work with, or somebody. Could be mom and say, Mom, I'm doing this goal. And I want to.
It could be, right?
It's not in your mind. And that's.
Do you want to disappoint her? Probably not, right? So yeah, saying it out loud is really important, and letting people know what your goal is. And I think that's, without that, it's so easy to slip. It's like any diet, any workout routine. You pay a trainer, you go once a week. It's so much easier to stay consistent than buying a gym membership and showing up whenever you feel like it.
Very true. What's your other principle?
So we'll talk about impact. So actually, going back to your example about writing a book, right? We decide that we want to do all of these. We want to write a book. We want to start a company. We want to get acquired. We have these goals. But what is the most important thing that you could be doing? And you have to prioritize that, because you can't do everything. Doing everything, of course, would be amazing. But everything that you choose to do and everything that you pick up takes away from everything else that you're already doing. So one thing, I mean, we do this organizationally, is we do weekly impact assessments for our roadmap at Dribble. So we make sure that the team is always working on what we deem to be, as a team, what we decide as a team to be the most impactful item that we could be building. And sometimes that means putting stuff down and picking other stuff up, because there's only so many hours in the week. So sometimes we are in the middle of projects and we have found something that is better, more impactful for us to build, and maybe we can do it faster. And so we will put down a project and pick something else up. And it used to drive the engineering team crazy, because you feel like, oh, I made progress. And now the goalposts have moved. But we've really worked on setting up a system internally so that it's okay. It doesn't feel like a failure to switch gears. We'll come back to that when it becomes the most important item again. And just like writing the book, right? You have to decide that if I take 6 months and I write a book and I publish it, that's going to change the trajectory of where I am today versus putting effort somewhere else. And so being able to determine for yourself what is going to be the most impactful, which forces you to really think through not only the project, but the results of that project. What are the best case scenarios? What's the worst case scenarios? And then taking an educated risk on what you're going to spend your time doing.
So it sounds like the key to creating impact, or the activities that deliver resultant impact, is being able to really focus and prioritize and keep that rotation going. So you're prioritizing those specific things that will result in impact.
Yep. I'll give you an example from my career with my podcast. So we started rocketship.fm because no one would take our phone call. And so we wanted to know how to grow a business, but no one would tell us, all the people that we looked up to. They weren't going to answer the phone and spend 30 minutes telling us and answering our novice questions. So we started a podcast. We're actually going to write a book. And so we said, well, why don't we write a book on how to build a rocket ship? That's where the name came from. And all of a sudden people started answering our call. And they said, hey, okay, I got 30 minutes. And we're like, we'll put you in the book, was our first pitch. And then as like a pre-warm up to the book, we said, all right, we're going to release these as a podcast. And so then these kind of became podcast interviews. And this is like 6 years ago. But what we found was we were like 4 months in, we were doing 3 interviews a week, right? So we had done 50 or 60 interviews at this point. And we realized that writing a book was really hard. It was going to take a long time for us to do it. And the podcast was actually taking off, and we were getting sponsorship inquiries. We could make money today from the podcast. And so we decided we're not going to write the book because it's not going to have the same impact as continuing to invest in this vehicle that's already working. We have the sponsorships, we have people answering our call, right? So while we set out to write a book, that was our goal. The impact, the highest impact that we could do to spend our time was to actually do the podcast. We were getting the same information out of people. It was a lot less time and a lot less risky than going through an expensive publishing process, because podcast was, you pay for a host and a website and the rest is free, right? It's pretty low cost, and we could reach the same amount of people. So that was an example of where focusing on the impact of our time, we had to make the hard call to give up our original goal of writing the book and continue to focus on what we felt like was the most impactful thing for us to do with the limited time that we had.
Okay, so I think I missed the first time around that a big part of this is actually mindset, because you need to link it to what you're ultimately trying to achieve as an end result. And it is mindset driven, and then allowing that mechanism to prioritize those sort of milestones and tasks to make that happen.
Yep.
Is one of the attributes.
And there's many ways to do it. Right? Yeah. Like really, we just wanted answers from people that we looked up to. We wanted 𝐂𝐤𝐡 to take our call. And whether that was through a book or a podcast or a YouTube channel, we achieved that. We thought the vehicle was going to be a book. It ended up being a podcast. We're still doing it, I guess, 7-8 years later now. But that was right. We had a goal. I don't even know if we realized it at the time, but our goal was to get information. We found the fastest vehicle for us in order to achieve that. And once we accomplished it, we just kept going.
I love it. Measure the impact of what you're doing and keep updating it. And
don't get focused on one idea, right? Like if we had just decided to write a book, I don't know if we'd still have a podcast that, has generated revenue since like week 3. And like how much revenue would a book be generating 7 years later? And nothing against books. I'm just saying for us, it probably wouldn't have had the same impact. So, because we weren't even good at writing. That being okay, we still achieved our final goal, but we gave up the original medium, the original origin idea that we had. And for us, it turned out much better than if we had really dug our heels in the sand and said, no, I'm going to do this. This is the only way.
Being agile. I think we got time to talk about another principle if you got one.
Longevity. The point around this was that most of the opportunities don't come. They come to the people that are in the game the longest, right? So the longer that you're around is when you're in M&A, right? And there are companies that start 3 years later, they sell. But I know like at Dribble, we're constantly evaluating M&A opportunities, and the alignment isn't always like when a company is looking to sell and when they want to sell and when we need to buy them, doesn't always align. Right? But it's those companies that are in the game for a really long time that are able to be available when the opportunity arises. And that could be a whale customer. That could be M&A opportunity. It could be a funding round, depending on what your goal is. But longevity allows you to really, I think it's the key to success here, is that willing to go the distance and not just trying to get that quick hit, but really being around. And there's so many opportunities that open up, especially if you're running a company in the long run, right? There's so many ways to continue to monetize a business that you're not going to realize in the first 2 years. If that's your only focus is hyper growth and exit, you're probably missing your biggest opportunity. And Facebook passed on Yahoo, right? There's all these famous stories, Snapchat passed on Facebook, where they chose longevity over the quick revenue hit. It turned out pretty well for them.
I agree with this one full-heartedly. This is why I think it's important to have a 10, 20-year vision, because the short-term view doesn't lead to that success. Things always take a lot longer, especially building a business like a construction project. It takes a lot longer and costs a lot more than you could imagine or think.
Always, right?
And I agree with this one, because even looking at our business with Deal Room, we started in 2012. So now we're 9 years into it.
Yeah.
Well, what's cool is seeing the velocity, because knowing that we've got all these inquiries about investments and acquisitions years ago for our business, but now seeing like, whoa, we're getting some real velocity. Even the podcast I host, I remember telling my daughter, she's only 9 years old at the time, I said, look, honey, we went from 26,000 downloads in 2019 to like 120 some thousand in 2020. And then she turns around and is like, Dad, does that mean I get paid more for doing the commercials for you?
They're too smart. That's the problem.
That's transparency works against you. You gotta.
But no, it's absolutely true. And also, you could have just given up that first year. 26,000 downloads. I don't know. This may not be worth it, right?
Man, that first 5 years of building Deal Room was horrendous. I was losing 200,000 a year, and there was no sign of traction, nothing. I knock on wood. I joke about it and saying, "Hey, this company should have went down," but it was. I always remember the one thing. I read this study about why all these startups fail for a number of reasons, and ultimately reading through it, I concluded the real number one reason why startups fail is because they give up. So I had this in my mind that as long as I don't give up, thinking of like a pre-mortem, that we'll figure things out. We'll get there. Whether it takes a year or 10 years, we'll get there. Like, let's just, as long as we don't give up. And that's the one thing I hung on to. It eventually paid off.
I mean, especially with startups, we've had just kind of this caustic narrative around success, which is really driven by VC culture, where we've propped up a few hyper growth companies and said, this is what success is, and anything other than this is failure. Right. And I think it's really dangerous, right? If you don't see that type of traction, you don't have 1 million customers in the first 2 years, it doesn't mean you're a failure. It just means, your business isn't growing. Like, it took you 5 years to really get a floor under you, right? And that's okay, right? That is totally fine. That's 96% of businesses, 99% of businesses. That's the actual experience of getting off the ground. But we don't talk about it, right? And so we focus on only this hyper growth, high funding. And the truth is, like, most of these companies just burn cash, which is, I mean, it's fine. That's the game for them, but that doesn't have to be the game that everybody plays. Yep. And it's okay to want to have a 10, 20-year strategy. It's okay to want to build a business that you want to go into work every day for 20 years. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think that's where great opportunity comes to those that maybe aren't the Ubers and the Twitters of the world.
I think that goes back to like how you want to make the impact, because you can rush to make a company, but there's good and bad around it. It could end up being a pretty fragile company versus you take your time, you really spend the time to hire the right people, build a culture that you truly are proud about and excited to work with and continue that growth. If you rush it and with a bunch of money and pressure with investors, then you sort of skip those steps.
You hire the wrong people, you build the wrong culture, you end up hating going to work every day. And I've had that. I've built a company that I hated going into. 5 years in, I would drive in, I'd just be miserable. And I was running the company, but it just becomes something I didn't like. We made too many sacrifices in the decision making, and it became something that I didn't enjoy. And so there's really no reason to waste your time, precious time we have here, creating something that you don't even want to be a part of anymore.
But playing on the long view, I fully agree with it. So one question I got to ask is, what's the best mistake you've ever made?
So that company I was talking about, I built a company 5 years. It was an agency, and I built it to the point where I didn't want to go in to work anymore because it wasn't a good fit for me anymore. And so I ended up just walking away from the business and just kind of leaving it behind. And I took 6 months to kind of wander around and make a whole lot. Started a couple companies that didn't go anywhere, but it was kind of directionless. And then I finally did get hired at Which, the parent company of Unsplash. And it was my first remote job. And it was about 6-7 years ago, I guess now. And it was the first time I ever worked remote, which has really set the trajectory. Dribble is 100% remote. I was able to move to Canada because of this opportunity. And I really wasn't qualified for the opportunity as a head of sales position. And I had just come off running a design agency. I never really worked at a company, honestly, in tech, but I took the role, and it ended up allowing myself, my family to move to Canada. So we now have permanent residence here. It ended up going through my first acquisition with Dribble, and has now led to taking over as taking on the role of GM of Dribble. And, but yeah, the whole opportunity kind of spawned from this failure of a company, this agency that we had built that just, it failed revenue wise, it failed culture wise. But out of that, I was able to move into, I don't know, a very fulfilling career.
It's a great story.
Thanks.
Hey, Michael, thank you so much for taking your time to share some of your principles with us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate having me on. It's really a pleasure.